Indycar has finally debuted its new hybrid units, and it's been a long time coming. And they debuted them at Mid-Ohio, but they've also used them at Iowa too, and I'm doing this a little bit later on so that we can look at both the effect that it's had on the ovals and on the road courses. But what's also interesting to note here is that Indycar has brought in these new hybrid units midway through the season. But the fact that it's come in mid-season isn't a case of Indycar mismanaging things. And I know I've made countless jokes of not knowing when there's an actual race on because the social media presence is awful, but the pandemic and supply chain issues that have resulted from it haven't helped. There's also been the fact that unlike in Formula 1 or even the WEC and IMSA with their hybrid engines, the cars have been brand new with the engines, whereas Indycar has had to see GM and Honda shoehorn this system into a chassis that's getting on for 13 years old at this point. And then there's the weight involved. Adding the hybrids to Formula 1 cars has shot the weight up over the years because they have to keep doing new crash testing and other bits and pieces to try and keep the units as safe as possible, because if one of those batteries ruptures, it's going to be one hell of a fire. But this has been a long time coming for IndyCar. Back in 2018, IndyCar announced just after the Indy 500 of that year that the then 2.2 litre engines would be upgraded to 2.4 litres at some point, so they'd be the same engine size as the F1 used back in 2013, albeit a twin-turbo V6 over a naturally aspirated V8, and would also allow for a push-to-pass system that could be used on road courses. All added up, it meant that the cars would be approaching power levels not seen since the heyday of kart back in the 90s. A couple of years later, IndyCar had intended to bring in a new hybrid system for 2022 in conjunction with a new car, but as we now see, only two of those things happened. There was no upgrade to a 2.4 litre engine, there was no new car, just the hybrids and the push-to-pass systems. These were delayed no fewer than 3 times to the point that the hybrids are now only just being introduced, and the 2.4 litre engines shelved until at least 2026, which would allow Honda and GM to get done what they need to get done. So with no new car on the way, IndyCar has had to modify everything to fit this whole new 48-volt hybrid system so that it would actually work properly with a car that is, well, as already mentioned, pretty old, and also get the relevant safety stuff in there as well and allow Honda and GM to get it all to work properly. Honda engineered one part of the system while GM did the other part so that they can be fully integrated as well and safely as possible. With 45 kilos of weight stripped off the car, the ERS and MGU systems can be housed inside a magnesium bell housing with as little issue as possible. Honda took on the energy recovery system, including the cooling and wiring, which is a different system to that used in Formula 1, while GM handled the motor generator unit and has now been mated to the existing V6 engines currently used by IndyCar. Using a different system to that used in Formula 1 has helped shed weight and has also allowed for the system to be used as intended. Remember that IndyCar doesn't just race on road and street circuits but on ovals too, which carries its own concerns with how best to recover the energy. So how are they going to store the electric energy, I hear you ask? Are they using batteries like in Formula 1? Don't you need batteries to have it as a hybrid? Well, not exactly. They're using supercapacitors instead, which is all part of the reason it's been able to all fit inside the existing Dallara chassis. IndyCar had considered using batteries like those used in Formula 1 and in IMSA and the WEC, but the engineering wizardry to get it all to fit was too much, and these supercapacitors will keep everything a little bit smaller. Supercapacitors store and release energy much like a battery does, but instead of all the energy being stored in the lithium or alkaline or whatever chemical is inside that battery, supercapacitors store all the energy as a static charge, which in turn means they charge up faster, deploy the energy faster, and a little bit more efficiently, I think, and they can be smaller and lighter than regular batteries, and now they are starting to creep over into road-going EVs and hybrids, and a couple of hydrogen cars too. But they've not fully taken over on the EV and hybrid market yet because the technology is still relatively new and needs a little more refinement. But once the technology has advanced a bit, charging an electric vehicle will take minutes rather than hours to achieve, and recharge more on the brakes at the same time. At least that's the goal, and they're smaller and lighter too, so the range might increase. One downside to them, at least currently, is that they're incredibly dense, so they can't store as much energy as the minute as a standard lithium-ion battery can. They're also not as good at holding their charge as a battery either, so if you were to charge up your car before going on holiday, you might come home a week later to find that only a fraction of the charge remains, although supercar manufacturers have already started using them for a boost in performance. Which is great for any circuit racing because you're constantly using the brakes to charge up the electrical batteries. That's what they do in Formula 1 and it's what they do in IMSA and also in the WEC. But for IndyCar there is an extra challenge because they race on ovals where you're doing little, if any, braking. What Indycar has developed for the ovals is a method of regenerating the electrical energy without the need to use the brakes. In some hybrid cars, the Hyundai Tucson being one of them, you can use the flappy paddles on the back of the steering wheel to change the amount of hybrid regeneration that you've got. When you lift off the throttle, the amount of braking you get from where you set the regeneration gets more or less depending on how you've set it. So if you've been on the motorway for a while, set it high and recharge when pulling up as you come off the slip road or something like that. This is also a thing in a Formula 1 car and in a prototype. The higher you set the regeneration, the more braking power you'll have and the shorter the braking distance. You turn it down and it's the opposite. So what they want to achieve, and they're doing this with a clutch paddle apparently, is that the drivers will use that instead of a brake that will allow them to essentially keep full throttle while dragging the brake a tiny bit. Not enough to properly hinder the performance of the car in a straight line, but enough that you'll actually put some energy back into the system. That way you can deploy some energy and use it as an oval push-to-pass system at places like Iowa and Texas, where getting a slingshot on the straight is incredibly difficult. And it also means they'll be able to lift and coast into corners at some ovals, either for dirty air, fuel saving and other bits and pieces, while putting some energy back into the system, because how else are they going to be able to do it? So how did it go at its first road course event at Mid-Ohio then? Scott Dixon's car conked out on the pay slab with some sort of technical gremlin getting into the system. Indycar has started an investigation into what happened, as the car just seemed to suck all the charge out the capacitors and die on him as he went out onto the track. Dixon had tried to restart the car, and this is something the cars can now do. What they'll do is they'll use the ERS that keeps 30 volts of power in the system at all times to restart the car if it stalls after a spin or coming out the pits or anything like that, but the car completely died going through turn 5. That doesn't mean that Dixon had to sit out the rest of the race though. He did get back out on track, but was something like 20 laps down when he did. Ganassi team members charged the capacitors back up, sent him on his way, and he seemed to be all fine and dandy after that, only for his car to break down again for good after 40 laps. But he was the only car to have this happen to him, which is pretty good going all things considered, but Ganassi might be wondering if it would have been a good idea to introduce the new engines at the start of 2025 for a smoother rollout, because who changes engine formula mid-season? But the system did show its potential for good, as Grosjean spun later on in the race and stalled the car, and was able to use the electrical motor to fire the engine up again and continue, which meant no full course yellow. But the teams lower down the grid would have definitely been wondering if it should have been rolled out for 2025. As the Indy Star reported, over the course of the testing for this new system, Penske, Ganassi, McLaren and Andretti racked up about 21,000 miles of testing before the likes of Juncos, Rahal and Carpenter got to have a run, with Rahal saying that the experience picked up by the other teams would have given them a massive advantage over the others, particularly with how it comes to oval racing, and that they would have probably worked out a meta strategy for using it all, or were at least close to it. But at the same time, the ability to call on people like Scott Dixon and Will Power for testing is probably better than calling on Canapino and Grosjean. And with Palou having a 35-point lead in the standings at the time of making this video, what if he suffers a string of hybrid failures and that loses him the championship? But at the same time, all the teams have most likely agreed to all of this, so if it happens, oh no anyway. But Marcus Ericsson has said some interesting things about these new hybrids and how they are different to how they are in Formula 1. In F1, the process of deploying and regenerating the hybrid is largely automatic, with a manual override being there to deploy all the ERS power available if need be, as a sort of push-to-pass button. But for an Indy car, the driver is doing pretty much all of it him or herself, which means that the driver is still going to be an integral part of how best to use all this, despite now having to do about 997 things at the same time. So what does that mean for the push-to-pass and other bits and pieces? That's all still there and will still be available for a total of 150 to 200 seconds total, depending on where they're racing. But the driver will be able to deploy the hybrid whenever it wants to, so there will be tactical deploys and saves throughout the race. Added up, it's going to be around 900 horsepower for using push-to-pass and the hybrid. From what I gather, I think it's going to be 2 full charges and depletions of the capacitors that they're going to be allowed to use during the course of a race. If they use any more of that, well, they run the capacitors down a second time, they won't be able to deploy any more. But all the nice things said about the system at Mid-Ohio seem to be the opposite for the Iowa doubleheader the weekend just gone. Ed Carpenter had some words to say about it, while Colton Herta had a hybrid failure. As Autosport described in a stat attack, there was a combined 500 laps at Iowa with no on-track passes for the lead, and only 195 overtakes over the 2 races. Last year, there was nearly 700. It also doesn't help matters that Iowa was recently resurfaced, but then so was Mid-Ohio, so there's going to be caveats to different bits and pieces, and Carpenter admitted that. But he also called the hybrid system the most expensive 100 pounds of weight he's ever bolted onto a car, and that oval racing was going to look like it had done at Iowa last weekend for the rest of the season. And 6 of the 9 events that hybrid will be used at this year will be ovals. Iowa, just gone, which had 2 races over the weekend, Gateway, the Milwaukee Mile, which will have 2 races over that weekend, and then the season finale at Nashville. I mean, Nashville, I think, is going to be using the Super Speedway aero, which is similar to what they're running at Indianapolis, while the other tracks use the short track aero package, which is quite similar to what the road course aero package is. I mean, it's all a little bit confusing with that kind of stuff, but Carpenter had actually tested the new hybrid system at Nashville and said that he didn't like it, so in an actual race situation, I think it's going to be wait and see. But one thing he did say was this to Autosport: to me, and from talking to people with the weight of the cars now, it's so hard to follow, and I think that's what you're going to see in subsequent events. When you can't follow close, you're not able to get a run to make passes. It's a challenge. It's something we're going to have to figure out as a sport because we've got too good of a product to take a decisive step back in our product by something of our own doing. Which sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? Formula 1 and the big chunky cars they've got there, where they can only really take one line through most corners, and with the exceptions of Silverstone and maybe Spa, you can't take that second line through a corner to get the exit onto a straight and get an overtake done. You're doing most of the overtakes now on DRS, if not all the overtakes on DRS, or, well, knackered tyres. But that's another way you can do it, but DRS is still the main way of getting by. And Carpenter said he does hope that they pull the system until 2025 to get some more refinement out of it. But this is the thing, how many more times can Indycar get away with delaying these engines? Moreover, how long can it keep putting off a new engine manufacturer, or a new car, or a new this, or a new that? And a new car might be needed given the scary accident involving Stingray Rob at Iowa at the weekend. You've got engines shoehorned into a chassis not made for it, with a safety device not intended for that chassis. Maybe it would have made sense to bring these hybrids with a new car than trying to apply it to something that is, as mentioned twice already, getting on for a 13-year-old chassis. But I guess that's for you to decide in the comments, because as Carpenter said, IndyCar has got too much momentum to mess it all up completely. Considering IndyCar fans like to shout how it's not as pedestrian and as expensive as Formula 1, Carpenter's criticisms and concerns are definitely something for IndyCar to look at. I'm not saying that the whole hybrid system is a dud, but maybe it needs a little more ironing out. But at the same time, can IndyCar afford any more delays? So then a look at IndyCar's opening 2 outings with its new hybrid on road courses and ovals, and how the general gist of how it all works and early reactions have set the tone. If this has given you food for thought, then do like the video so I know a good job was done, and for more from this channel, get subscribed and also get the Townsend bell on so you never miss out on any future content. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to join the people on your screen, then you can do so by heading to the link in the description, where there's also helpful directions to Discord, socials, and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. There's also super thanks for one and done donations or memberships for those seeking a Patreon alternative. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.